The sound left my throat before I could stop it. It always happened that way. In the quiet hours, when the last candle in the servants' corridor had burned to nothing, and the stone walls of Veldrath Keep seemed to press inward like a fist slowly closing. The song would rise without permission, born somewhere between my ribs and my memory, and I would sing it low and broken, barely louder than breath, as though even the shadows might judge me for it. I was not supposed to be in this part of the castle. The eastern wing, third corridor, second alcove past the iron gate. This was not a place for Omega servants. It was not a place for anyone truly, which was precisely why I came here. The stones were older here, rougher, and they smelled of cold water and ancient timber and something faintly like cedar, though no cedar tree grew within these walls. I had found the alcove 3 months past, when I was fleeing the Beta Lord Cedric's sharp tongue after I had spilled a pitcher of warm mead across his lap at the evening feast. I had not done it on purpose. I rarely did anything on purpose that ended in disaster. These things simply found me, the way rain finds open windows. The alcove was barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. A narrow ledge of stone jutted from the wall at the height of a bench, and if I tucked my gray wool cloak around me and drew my knees close, I could sit here for an hour without being seen from the corridor. Above me, a single arrow slit let in a sliver of the night sky, just enough moonlight to silver the ends of my braid and turn the pale linen of my dress the color of old bone. I was crying, but quietly. I had learned to cry quietly years ago. The gathering of ranks was in 4 days. Every Omega in the kingdom knew what that meant. Every Beta knew it too, and every Gamma, though they would not say so aloud. Once each year, when the frost moon rose full and heavy over the Veldrath Mountains, the Alpha King called all unmated Omegas of serving age before the Great Hall for inspection. That was the word the court heralds used, inspection, as if we were bolts of cloth to be measured against a merchant's thumb. The ceremony was older than the keep itself, older than King Roman's father and his father before him. Its purpose, according to the scrolls the court scholars were so fond of quoting, was to ensure the proper placement and protection of all unbonded Omegas within the realm. What it meant, in practice, was that we stood in a row, and the High Lords looked at us, and some of us were reassigned to other households, and occasionally, very occasionally, one was chosen. Chosen for what precisely depended on the choosing lord. Most of us were simply moved like pieces on a game board, traded between noble houses that needed more hands in the kitchens or more voices in the healing wards. I had survived 3 gatherings without incident, which was either good fortune or simple invisibility. I suspected the latter. I was not remarkable to look at, pale and slight, with a long blonde braid that my fellow servant Petra said made me look like a milkmaid who had wandered into the wrong hall, and gray-green eyes that my mother had called the color of the sea before a storm, in the one tender moment I could still remember of her. I was 23 years old, and had served Veldrath Keep since I was 15. And in 8 years, I had made myself as unremarkable as the alcove stones around me. But this year was different. This year, King Roman himself would preside. He had not attended the gathering in 6 years, not since his mate had died in the winter of his 3rd year of rule, and the grief had closed him like a drawbridge pulled up against a siege. The court whispered about it still, in the spaces between formal words. Lady Seraphine, they said, golden-haired and fierce and beloved, gone before the first snows of her 2nd winter as queen. The king had not taken another mate, had not looked at another woman with anything beyond the cold, calculating attention of a man who had simply stopped expecting the world to offer him something worth wanting. And now, he was coming to the gathering. The court had not spoken of much else for a fortnight. The noble ladies had ordered new gowns. Lord Cedric had laughed too loudly at feast 3 nights running, and the sound had made my jaw ache. Even old Marta, who supervised the Omega servants and claimed to feel nothing about anything, had pressed her lips together in that particular way she had, and said quietly, to no one in particular, The king's presence changes the weight of things. I did not know what she meant then. I was beginning to understand it now. I pressed my back against the alcove wall and let the song come. It was not a song I had been taught. It was not a proper song at all. More a series of notes that my mother had hummed when I was very small, before everything changed, before I understood what it meant to be an omega in a world built by and for alphas. The melody had no name that I knew of. It moved in a slow, winding pattern, rising and falling like water over uneven ground. And when I sang it, I felt something loosen in my chest, some knotted thing that I carried through every waking hour without quite acknowledging its weight. The words I had added myself over years, whenever the grief or the fear or the exhaustion needed somewhere to go. They were not grand words. They spoke of small things: warm bread, a lit hearth, the sound of rain against stone, the particular quality of light on a winter afternoon when the work was done, and no one needed anything from you for one blessed hour. They were the words of a woman who had learned to find comfort in miniature, because the larger comforts had never been hers to hold. My voice cracked on the third verse, and I let it. I pressed my fingers against my mouth for a moment, steadying myself. 4 days, I would stand in a row with the other omegas, and the king would be there, watching with those pale wolf-gray eyes I had never seen but heard, described 100 times. And something would shift in the world, and I did not know if the shift would pass over me like it always did, or if this time it would land. The fear of being noticed and the fear of being overlooked had become, in these last weeks, almost indistinguishable from each other. I drew a slow breath and let the song rise again, softer this time, almost just the shape of it without the sound. A stone shifted in the corridor. Not the settling creak of an old castle at night. A deliberate weight. A footstep, placed with the careful precision of someone who did not wish to be heard and was very nearly succeeding. I stopped breathing. The moonlight through the arrow slit lay across the corridor entrance in a thin silver stripe, and I watched it, absolutely still, as the silence stretched, and then, there. A shadow crossed the light. Too large for a servant, too controlled for a guard making routine rounds. The shadow paused at the corridor entrance and did not move, and in the ringing quiet, I became suddenly, acutely aware that whoever stood just beyond my sight had stopped because they were listening. My song had carried further than I knew, and someone had followed it. I did not move. This was not bravery. This was the particular stillness of a small creature that understands, on some ancient and wordless level, that motion invites attention, and attention invites consequence. I had learned it the way I had learned most things, not from instruction, but from necessity. 8 years in a castle full of alphas and betas who could hear a heartbeat change its rhythm from 20 paces taught you either stillness or suffering, and I had chosen stillness every time it was available to me. But my heart was not cooperating. It knocked against my ribs with the graceless insistence of a servant at a locked door, and I pressed my palm flat against my sternum as though I could quiet it through pressure alone. The shadow in the corridor had not moved. Whoever stood there was patient, unnervingly so, and the patience itself told me something. Servants hurried. Guards marched. Noble lords announced themselves with the noise of their own certainty, boots heavy, voices ready. This silence was different. It had authority in it. I counted 7 slow breaths before the shadow shifted. Not retreating. Moving closer. The figure that stepped into the narrow moonlit corridor was tall. Taller than any man I served. Taller than Lord Cedric, who stood a full head above most of the household guard. He wore black leather armor, the kind worn by warriors who had not finished their day and did not intend to, crossed with dark straps at the chest and belted at the waist with worn brown leather. His hair was dark and long, pulled back in braids that fell past his shoulders, and even in the dim corridor light, I could see the faint scar that crossed his jaw. A thin old line, pale against his skin. the kind that came from something serious that had happened long ago and been survived. His eyes, when they found me in the alcove shadow, were the gray of winter sky just before snow. I had never seen King Roman of Veldrath before. I knew him immediately. For 3 entire seconds, neither of us spoke. I sat frozen on my stone ledge with my hands pressed together in my lap, and my braid coming loose at the end, and my face still carrying the evidence of crying. I could feel it, the tightness around my eyes, the rawness at the edges of my mouth. And he stood in the corridor looking at me with an expression I could not read. It was not the cold dismissal I had expected from every account I had ever heard of him. It was not anger at finding a servant where no servant should be. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been struck by something he had not seen coming. Then the expression closed, and he was simply the king again, still, contained, and unreadable as a sealed dispatch. "You should not be in this corridor," he said. His voice was low, not loud in the way that powerful men's voices often were, pitched to fill rooms and silence opposition. Low in the way that deep water is low, with the suggestion of enormous weight moving slowly beneath a calm surface. "No, Your Majesty," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I deserved. "I should not." A pause. He did not look away. "How long have you been coming here?" I considered lying. It would have been the sensible thing. "This is my first time, Your Majesty." "I was lost, Your Majesty." "I meant no harm, Your Majesty." All true enough to be defensible and vague enough to close the conversation quickly. But something about the way he asked, not with suspicion, exactly, but with the focused attention of a man who actually wanted to know the answer, made me answer honestly before I had fully decided to. 3 months, I said, since the Feast of the Harvest Moon. Something moved through his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. 3 months, and in 3 months, no one found you. "No one looks here," I said. And then, because honesty apparently had no sense of self-preservation, I added, "including you, until tonight." The almost amusement sharpened slightly. He stepped closer. Not menacingly, just enough that I could see him more clearly, and he me, and looked at me with that unnerving winter-gray steadiness. "I heard something," he said, "from the upper passage." He paused, and the pause had weight. The singing. Heat crawled up my neck and settled in my face. I was grateful for the dimness of the corridor. "I apologize. Your Majesty, I did not intend to disturb—" "You did not disturb me." He said it simply, without inflection, which somehow made it more difficult to respond to than anger would have been. He studied the alcove for a moment, the narrow ledge, the arrow slit, the particular tucked-away quality of it, and then looked back at me. "What is your name?" "Maisie," I said. "Maisie of the Veldrath household servants, Your Majesty. Omega rank. I serve under Marta in the inner keep." He repeated my name once, quietly, as if testing the shape of it. Then, "The song you were singing, I did not recognize it." "It has no proper name, Your Majesty. It is—" I stopped, unsure how to explain something I had never been required to explain before. "It is mine, I suppose." "Yours," he said, in a tone that might have been many things. "I made it," I said, which sounded foolish the moment I heard it, so I added, "Over time, in pieces. It is not a proper composition. A court musician would find it laughable." I was talking too much. I did this when I was nervous. Words came out like water finding cracks in old stone, following the path of least resistance with no particular destination. "I am sorry, Your Majesty. I will find somewhere else to—" I will not disturb this corridor again. I began to rise from the ledge, gathering my cloak, preparing to be dismissed with whatever consequence he chose. Extra duties, reassignment, a formal reprimand before Marta that would follow me into the gathering and mark me as trouble before I had even stood in the row. "Sit down, Maisie." I sat down. He did not sit. He stood in the corridor with his arms at his sides and his gray eyes on the arrow slit above my head. And for a long moment, he simply breathed. And I watched him without meaning to. And something about the angle of his jaw and the set of his shoulders told me that he was carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with armor. "The upper passage connects to the old war room," he said finally. "I come there sometimes, at night." He did not explain further, and I did not ask. But I understood, the way you understand things that are said in the space between words. He came there to be alone, as I came here. The keep was full of people who had never truly been alone in their lives, and had no idea what they were missing. And it was also full of people who were desperately, exhaustingly alone in rooms crowded with courtiers and servants and political expectation. King Roman of Veldrath, I was beginning to understand, was the second kind. "The gathering is in 4 days," he said. He was still looking at the arrow slit. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Are you afraid of it?" The question caught me so entirely off guard that I answered before the instinct to deflect could engage. "Yes." He looked at me then, fully, the way he had looked at me when he first stepped into the corridor, before he had reassembled his composure, with that fractured, almost human quality that powerful men rarely let anyone witness. "Good," he said, and the word came out quiet and a little rough. "Fear means you understand the weight of things." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and the silence stretched between us and did not feel, strangely, like silence between a king and a frightened servant girl. It felt like something else, something I had no proper name for, something I had also been assembling in pieces without quite knowing what I was building. He straightened then, and the king came back fully. The posture, the contained weight, the eyes that closed against anything they were not ready to show. "You will not be reassigned," he said. "Whatever you fear from the gathering, that particular outcome is not among the possibilities. I will see to it." I stared at him. "Your Majesty, why?" He had already turned to go. He paused at the corridor entrance, his broad shoulders filling the narrow frame, the black fur of his mantle catching the faint moonlight. "Because anyone who builds something beautiful out of nothing," he said without turning around, "and keeps it hidden in the walls of a castle so no one can take it from her, that person deserves at least one thing they do not have to be afraid of losing." Then he was gone. The corridor was empty, and the moonlight lay unchanged across the stone floor, and I sat on my ledge with my hands in my lap, and my heart doing something entirely new and unrecognizable in my chest. 4 days until the gathering. I was no longer certain fear was the only thing I felt about it. I told no one. This was not difficult. I was not by nature a person who told things. Petra, who slept in the narrow bed beside mine in the Omega servants' dormitory, and who had the warm, relentless sociability of someone who had never once needed silence, noticed that something was different about me the morning after the alcove encounter, and immediately began constructing theories. "You look like someone who swallowed a secret," she said, braiding her own dark hair in the gray pre-dawn light, while I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. Petra was 25, round-faced and quick-eyed, with a beta mother and an omega father, and a laugh that could fill a corridor. She was the closest thing I had to a friend in Veldrath Keep, which meant I was fond of her, and also perpetually exhausted by her. Was it a person-shaped secret? Those are always the most interesting kind. "I found a loose stone in the eastern corridor," I said. "I was thinking about whether to report it to the master of the keep." Petra looked at me for a long moment. You are a terrible liar, Maisie. The stone is genuinely loose. I believe you about the stone, she said. I do not believe that is what you are thinking about. She was correct, but I held the secret the way I held everything that mattered to me, close to the center, out of reach, wrapped in the ordinary so that no one thought to look for it. I carried the king's words through the following days like stones in my pocket, smooth and weighted, something to press my fingers against when the anxiety of the approaching gathering threatened to pull me under. Anyone who builds something beautiful out of nothing deserves at least one thing they do not have to be afraid of losing. I turned the words over and over. I examined them for pity. I was proud enough to be wounded by pity, even from a king, even when it was offered gently. But I could not find it in them. What I found instead was something that sat closer to recognition, and that was somehow more unsettling than pity would have been. Pity looked at a person and saw their lack. Recognition looked at a person and saw them. I was not accustomed to being seen. The morning of the gathering came with frost. I woke before the dawn bell and lay in the dark, listening to Petra breathe and the wind move against the high, narrow windows and the distant sound of the kitchen fires being stoked in the lower keep. The cold had come down from the mountains in the night and settled into the stones of the castle the way cold always did here. Not dramatically, but thoroughly, working its way into every surface until the whole world felt like it had been kept in a cellar. Marta came for us at first light. She was a small woman, Marta, with iron-gray hair cut short beneath her linen cap and eyes the color of old wood, dark and dense, with rings that suggested depth. She had been supervising Omega servants in Veldrath Keep for 20 years, and she regarded all of us with the particular affection of someone who has learned not to grow too attached to things that are regularly rearranged by forces beyond her control. She was not unkind. She was practical in the way that people become practical when kindness has cost them something. Up, she said, and we were up. Wash. Your good dresses, the clean ones. Hair neat. You have until the second bell. There were 7 of us in the dormitory. 7 Omega women of various ages. I was among the middle, who braided and pinned and smoothed and adjusted in the small mirror above the wash basin in near silence, because the gathering was one of those occasions that burned the usual chatter away. Even Petra was quiet, which told me more about the weight of the morning than anything else could have. My good dress was gray wool, cleaner and finer than my daily wear, with a brown leather belt that cinched at the waist and small wooden buttons at the collar. I wore my gray cloak over it, the same cloak I wore to the alcove, I realized, and pressed the thought down before it could become something visible on my face. My braid I did carefully, pulling the strands smooth and tight, and I looked at myself in the mirror for exactly long enough to confirm that I looked neat, and no longer, because longer invited the kind of self-examination I had no use for this morning. We walked to the great hall in a line behind Marta, through corridors that were already busy with the organized commotion of a court day. Noble ladies moved in clusters with their attendants, wearing colors I could not afford to name. Beta lords stood in doorways exchanging words that fell quiet when we passed. The castle smelled of wood smoke and beeswax candles, and the particular metallic cold that came through the high windows. And under all of it, faint but present, the smell of tension, that collective alertness of a large group of people waiting for something to happen. The great hall of Veldrath was the oldest part of the keep. Its ceiling rose so high that torchlight did not reach it, and the stone walls were hung with tapestries so old their colors had faded to suggestions, dark shapes that might have been wolves or battles or both. The floor was worn smooth by generations of feet, and the high table at the far end sat on a raised dais of black stone where the king's chair stood empty and waiting, carved from dark wood and strapped with iron, looking less like a seat and more like a statement. We filed in with the other Omega servants from the outer keep in the village households, perhaps 40 women in total, arranged in rows before the dais, with the noble lords and court observers ranged along the walls on either side. Lord Cedric was there, red-faced and important-looking. Lady Drusilla, who governed the Northern Tower household, stood with her beta steward and looked at us the way one looks at bolts of cloth, as I had always known she would. Several lords I did not know by name, but recognized by the particular quality of their attention: assessing, categorizing, proprietary. I stood in the third row, between Petra and a young Omega named Signa, who had come to the keep only 2 months past, and who was trembling so finely that I could feel it where her arm pressed against mine. I pressed back slightly. She did not look at me, but her trembling eased a fraction. The herald struck his staff against the stone floor 3 times. The hall went silent, and then King Roman walked in. He came without announcement, which I understood later was deliberate. He had never liked ceremony for its own sake, preferring to let his presence do the work that other men required heralds and trumpets to accomplish. He entered through the side door beside the dais, wearing armor similar to what he had worn in the corridor but formal now, with a dark fur mantle across his shoulders and the iron circlet of Veldrath on his brow. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything because everything would wait for him regardless. He did not look at the rows of Omega women immediately. He took his place before the great chair without sitting and surveyed the room. The lords, the court observers, the tapestried walls, the cold stone floor, with those winter-gray eyes that missed nothing and offered nothing in return. Then, finally, his gaze moved to the rows before him. I felt it before it reached me. That sounds like the kind of thing people say in stories, because it sounds beautiful. I mean it literally. There was a quality to his attention, even across a crowded hall, even when it was directed elsewhere, that registered in the body before the mind could explain it. Like the pressure change before a storm. Like the moment a fire finds new air. His gaze moved along the first row, the second, then the third, and stopped. Not at me. Not yet. Or perhaps not obviously. He was too controlled for obvious. But something shifted in the quality of his stillness, the way stillness itself can change without moving, and I became aware with sudden and complete certainty that he had found me in the crowd. Beside me, Petra inhaled quietly. "Maisie," she breathed, barely a sound. "Don't," I whispered back, just as quietly. Lord Cedric had stepped forward to begin the formal proceedings, the reading of names, the household declarations, the legal language that turned human beings into administrative categories. His voice filled the hall with self-importance, and I kept my eyes forward and my hands clasped, and my expression arranged into the careful blankness I had spent years perfecting. But I could feel the king's gaze like winter sunlight, present and cold and warming in spite of itself. And when Lord Cedric reached my name in his recitation, Maisie, Omega servant, inner keep, unmatched, available for reassignment, a sound moved through the assembled lords along the wall, a murmur, an anticipation. King Roman spoke for the first time since entering the hall. "That one," he said, "is not available for reassignment." The words landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Every ripple moved outward from me. The hall did not erupt. It did something quieter and more dangerous than eruption. It held its breath. 40 women and 36 noble lords, and every court observer and herald and guard along the walls, all became, in that single suspended moment, completely still. The kind of stillness that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and the world is taking a moment to reorganize itself around the new fact. Lord Cedric's mouth was open. He had been mid-breath when the king spoke, and now he stood with his scroll half raised and his face performing a complicated series of expressions that moved through surprise, calculation, and wounded importance before settling on something that wanted to be dignified. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the Omega in question is currently unassigned to any—" "I am aware of what she is currently assigned to," King Roman said. His voice had not raised. It never needed to. She is assigned to the inner keep under Marta's supervision, where she has served adequately for 8 years. That assignment will not change. The word adequately landed oddly in my ears, not because it was dismissive, but because it was so clearly chosen. A deliberate understatement. A door closed against something larger. I understood, in the way I was beginning to understand this man. In glimpses, in negative space, in what was withheld rather than offered, that he had chosen the smallest possible word to draw the smallest possible attention. It did not work. Lady Drusilla, who governed the northern tower, and had never in my experience failed to say the thing most likely to complicate a situation, stepped forward from the wall. She was a tall woman, angular and precise, with silver hair coiled beneath a dark veil, and eyes that had been calculating things since before most of us were born. "The king honors the household with his attention," she said, in the tone of a woman who is being very careful about what she says, because she is thinking something quite different. Though it is unusual for the crown to retain specific interest in an individual servant outside the formal selection process. "Many things are unusual," the king said. "They remain valid regardless." Another ripple through the hall. Smaller this time, but deeper. I stood in the 3rd row and breathed through it. In through the nose, slow and even, out the same way. Petra had gone utterly rigid beside me. The way a person goes rigid when they are physically restraining the urge to grab someone by the arm. Sina, on my other side, had stopped trembling entirely, which was either reassurance or shock, and I could not determine which. The gathering continued. This was the strange thing. Life continued. The formal proceedings moved forward. Names were read, and assignments were confirmed and adjusted, and the machinery of the court ground on, with its usual self-important efficiency, and all of it happened around the fact of what the king had said, as if around a stone dropped in a path. Everyone walking past it. No one quite able to stop looking at it. I was not reassigned. True to his word. When Marta collected us afterward and walked us back through the corridor in our orderly line, she did not speak until we had passed the great doors and moved into the quieter passage beyond. Then she said, without looking at any of us in particular, "Back to your duties. There is bread to be set and floors to be swept, and the world does not pause for ceremony." We dispersed. Petra caught my wrist as I turned toward the inner keep stairway. "Walk with me," she said. It was not a question. We walked. She waited until we had rounded 2 corners and found a stretch of empty corridor before she turned to face me with the expression of a woman who has been sitting on a great deal of words and can no longer contain them responsibly. "Maisie," she said. "I know," I said. "He looked at you." "I know. Before Cedric read your name. He had already found you. I was standing right there. I watched his eyes. Petra, I move along the rows and stop, and the way he stopped was not the way a king looks at a servant he is simply choosing not to reassign for administrative reasons. That was not. Petra. I kept my voice low and even, and put my hand briefly on her arm. "I need you to be careful. Please." She stopped. The urgency in her face shifted into something more serious, and she looked at me for a moment with the particular clarity that lived beneath her sociability, the sharp, loyal intelligence that was the real reason I valued her company. "How careful?" she asked quietly. "Very," I said. "Whatever you think you saw, keep it in your own chest for now. The court has ears everywhere, and some of them belong to people who would use this poorly." She nodded slowly. Then, "Are you all right?" The question was so simply and genuinely meant that it took me a moment to answer it properly. Was I all right? I was frightened. I was also something else entirely. Something that did not have a name yet. Something that had been building since a king had stood in a moonlit corridor and listened to a song that was not meant for him. and then treated it as though it were precious. "I am managing," I said, which was true. She squeezed my hand once and let me go. 3 days passed. They passed in the way that strange days pass. At once, too slowly and too fast. Each hour both interminable and gone before I had finished examining it. I swept floors and set bread and carried trays and mended linens and did every ordinary thing with the slightly heightened attention of a person who has been made aware that the ordinary world is thinner than it appears, that extraordinary things can be waiting just on the other side of a stone wall or a corridor corner. I did not go to the alcove. I told myself this was prudence. The king knew where the alcove was now, and returning felt like a statement I was not ready to make. But the truth was simpler and harder. I was afraid that going back would break something, that the memory of that night, already worn smooth from handling, would lose its edges if I pressed it against reality again. On the second day, a message came. Not delivered by a royal herald, that would have been noticed by everyone in the inner keep within minutes. It was Marta who brought it, tucking it into my hand during the morning bread setting, with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent 20 years moving things between people who could not be seen to move things between themselves. A folded square of parchment, sealed with plain wax, no crest. I opened it that evening, in the dormitory, after Petra had fallen asleep. The handwriting was precise and spare, each letter formed with the economy of someone accustomed to writing orders rather than correspondence. There were very few words. The War Room Library. Tonight, 2 hours past the evening bell. If you choose not to come, nothing changes. R. I read it 3 times. Then I held it over the dormitory candle and watched it become nothing. 2 hours past the evening bell, I was at the War Room Library. It was a room I had never entered before. A chamber in the eastern tower, above the alcove corridor, accessible by a stairway that most servants had no reason to climb. The door was heavy oak, banded in iron, and it stood slightly open, warm light pressing through the gap. I pushed it open and went in. The room was large and low-ceilinged for a tower room, its walls dense with shelves carrying scrolls and bound manuscripts and rolled maps weighted at the corners with iron discs. A long table dominated the center, scarred with use, covered in the organized chaos of active study. Open books, ink-stained parchment, a compass and measuring tools, a half-eaten loaf of bread that made the very human reality of it almost startling. King Roman stood at the far shelf, his back to me, pulling a manuscript from between 2 others. He had removed the formal mantle and the iron circlet. Without them, he was simply a very large, very tired-looking man in dark leather and braided hair, and something about that, the absence of the trappings, the plainness of him in a quiet room with bread on the table and old books on the walls, made my chest do something complicated. He turned when he heard me enter. Something in his shoulders released by a fraction. "You came," he said. "You said nothing would change if I didn't," I said. That was either true, in which case I was free to choose, or it was untrue, in which case I would rather know it now. He looked at me for a moment. It was true. Then I came because I chose to. He set the manuscript on the table and gestured to the chairs near the hearth, 2 of them, plain and worn, arranged at an angle to each other before a low fire. Not a throne, not a formal arrangement. 2 chairs in front of a fire, as if the meeting were between people rather than positions. I sat. He sat. The fire spoke between us. "The court is talking," I said, "because someone had to." "The court is always talking," he said. "I stopped managing that particular problem 6 years ago." 6 years, I said carefully. He looked at the fire. The scar along his jaw caught the light. "You know what happened 6 years ago." "I know what the court says." "And what does the court say?" I weighed my words. "That you lost someone. That it closed you." A silence. Then, Both are accurate. He turned his gaze from the fire to me, and there was something in it that I was learning to recognize. That fractured quality, that almost human aperture that opened sometimes beneath the king's composure. I have not sat with anyone in this room voluntarily in a very long time. Why me? I asked. The question I had been carrying for 4 days. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, the way people speak when they are saying true things they have not said before. Because you were sitting alone in the dark building, something beautiful, and you were crying, he said, and you were not asking anyone to notice. That is not, he added, with a slowness that suggested he was surprising himself, a thing I have seen very often. The fire settled. A log shifted and released a small shower of sparks. Outside, the wind moved against the tower walls, and the night pressed close around us, and I sat in a worn chair across from the King of Veldrath, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely found. Winter came early to Veldrath that year. It arrived not with the gradual cooling that the older servants predicted by watching the geese and reading the bark of the birch trees along the eastern ridge, but suddenly, overnight, dropping from the mountains like a decision that had already been made somewhere above the clouds. I woke 3 weeks after the gathering to find the world outside the dormitory window transformed, the inner courtyard white and still, the fountain frozen mid-motion, the stones of the keep wearing a skin of frost that caught the early light and held it. I lay in my narrow bed and watched the light change, and thought about the 8 evenings I had spent in the war room library. We had not announced them. We had not named them. They happened the way necessary things happen between people who are too careful to rush and too honest to pretend. Quietly, incrementally, with the slow accumulation of small, true things set across a fire in a room full of old books and worn maps and the companionable silence of 2 people learning the shape of each other's solitude. He told me about the border campaigns he had ridden in his 20s, before the crown. He told me about the council lords who tested him in the early years of his rule, each one convinced that a young king's grief made him manageable. He told me about the war room library itself, how it had been his father's room, and how he had come here after Seraphine died not to mourn but to think, because thinking was the only thing that had felt honest, when everything else felt like performance. I told him about my mother and the song, about coming to the keep at 15 with nothing but the clothes I wore and the melody in my chest and the fierce, wordless determination not to disappear entirely, about learning to read from the healer's apprentice, secretly, in the hour before dawn, because knowledge felt like the one thing that could not be taken by reassignment or rank, or the indifference of a world that sorted people like grain, about building the alcove into a kind of interior country, a place that was mine because I had found it, not because anyone had given it to me. He listened the way attentive people listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what I said, turning it over, asking questions that proved he had heard the detail and not just the shape of it. On the 5th evening, he had asked me to sing. I had refused, the first time. The song was private in a way that was difficult to explain. I had already been heard without consent, and choosing to be heard felt different and larger and required more courage than I immediately had. He had accepted this without argument, which was itself a kind of answer. On the 7th evening, I had sung. Not the full song, just the wordless melody, the winding pattern of notes, sitting in my chair with my hands in my lap, and my eyes on the fire, and my voice low enough that it barely carried past the hearthstones. When I finished, the room was very quiet. He did not say it was beautiful. He did not say anything for a long while. When he finally spoke, he said, "It sounds like someone who has decided to survive." That was when I understood that whatever was happening between us had already moved past the point where I could examine it from a safe distance. It had become something I was inside of. The trouble came on a morning of hard frost, as trouble often does, arriving without courtesy in the middle of ordinary things. I was carrying a tray of ink and fresh parchment to the scriptorium when I turned a corner and found myself face to face with Lady Drusilla and two of her attendants. She stopped walking. I stopped walking. Her attendants arranged themselves slightly behind her, in the way of people who have learned that proximity to a powerful woman's displeasure is best managed by small degrees of physical distance. "Maisie," she said. She knew my name now. That was new. "My lady," I said, and dipped appropriately. "Walk with me." It was the same non-question Petra used, but in Lady Drusilla's voice it carried a different quality entirely. The implication that the invitation was formality, not choice. I walked with her. She dismissed her attendants with a gesture, and we moved through the corridor in a silence she let stretch deliberately, which was a technique for making people nervous, and she knew it, and she knew that I knew it and used it anyway, because the goal was not subtlety, but effect. "The court has been observing," she said finally, "certain patterns. My lady." "Do not," she said without heat, "perform confusion at me. You are not a confused woman. That is rather the issue." I said nothing. This also was a technique, not hers mine. She glanced at me sideways, and something in her expression shifted slightly, as if she were recalibrating. "I am not your enemy," she said. "I want you to understand that before I say the rest." "I understand, my lady." "Lord Cedric has begun asking questions," she said. "About the gathering, about the king's intervention on your behalf. He has been speaking to 3 other lords, Harwick, Brennan, and old Lord Foss, and they are constructing a concern." She paused. "The concern, as they are framing it, is that the king is making decisions influenced by an inappropriate attachment to a servant of Omega rank, and that this represents a vulnerability in the crown's judgment that the council would be within its rights to formally address." The cold of the corridor seemed to deepen. "They would challenge the king," I said quietly. "They would challenge the king's clarity of mind," she said, which was a different and more dangerous thing. "In the council chamber, with the formal language of governance, which gives it a legitimacy that simple gossip does not carry." She looked at me steadily. "I tell you this not to frighten you, but because you should know that the consequences of what is happening between you and the king do not fall only on you. And because I believe you are intelligent enough to understand what I am saying, without requiring me to be cruel about it." I stood in the cold corridor with my tray of ink and parchment, and understood exactly what she was saying. That I was the vulnerability. That my presence in the king's life gave his enemies a handle to grasp. That the most efficient solution, from the perspective of everyone's safety, including his, was for me to withdraw, back into invisibility, back into the ordinary flow of servant life, back into the alcove where I belonged. "Thank you, my lady," I said. "I will think carefully on what you have shared." She studied me for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and walked away, and I stood alone in the corridor and let the weight of it settle. I went to the war room library that evening. He knew something was wrong before I had crossed the threshold. I saw it in the way he turned from the shelf, the way his eyes moved over me with that focused attention that still caught me off guard, even after weeks of it. I told him everything. I did not soften it or rearrange it. I sat in my worn chair and laid out what Lady Drusilla had said with the same plainness I would use to describe a problem in the household accounts, because the truth deserved plainness, and so did he. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The fire was lower tonight. The room felt closer. "Cedric has been building this for weeks," he said finally. "I am not surprised." "Then you knew it was coming." "I knew something was coming. Men like Cedric require an audience for their ambitions, and the council chamber is his stage." He looked at the fire. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who is solving something rather than feeling it. Then he looked at me. "What do you want to do?" The question surprised me so completely that I stared at him. "I am asking you," he said. "Not informing you, not managing you. I am asking what you want." I had spent so many years not being asked that the question sat strangely in me for a moment before I could reach it properly. What did I want? I wanted the song in my chest and the alcove and the warm fire-lit room and the man who listened without waiting for his turn to speak. I wanted the thing that had been quietly building between us to be given room to finish building, without being dismantled by men who were threatened by anything they could not categorize and control. I wanted to not disappear again. "I want to stay," I said. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, but a deep and quiet relief, as if a door he had not dared open all the way had finally been permitted to swing wide. He stood and crossed the room and stood before my chair and offered me his hand. Not a command, just an open hand, waiting. And I looked at it for one long moment, and then I took it. His fingers closed around mine, warm and steady, and he said quietly, "Then we face it together. Whatever they bring to the council chamber, we bring truth back to it. Your history here, your character, the testimony of every person who has watched you work and live honestly in these walls for 8 years. We do not hide, Maisie. We simply stand still and let them see clearly." The council convened 5 days later. Lord Cedric made his case with the florid confidence of a man who had rehearsed it. Lord Harwick and Lord Brennan added their voices. Old Lord Foss, who was 70 and had navigated more court politics than any of them combined, said very little and watched everything. King Roman let them finish. He did not interrupt once, which seemed to unsettle them more than argument would have. Then Marta stood. Small, iron-haired Marta, who claimed to feel nothing about anything, who had brought me a folded message without being asked, and had never once in 20 years misread a person she had watched daily. She spoke for 7 minutes in the level, precise voice of a woman presenting evidence to people she did not particularly respect. And what she presented was 8 years. 8 years of work, of character, of a young woman who had arrived with nothing and built something honest and reliable and genuinely good out of the materials available to her. Petra stood after. Then Sina, still slight and still quiet, who said only that on the morning of the gathering she had been trembling, and the woman beside her had pressed back against her arm without making it a thing, and that this was the kind of person Maisie of the Inner Keep was, and she would say so to any council in any kingdom. Lord Foss, after all of them, looked at Lord Cedric for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between a genuine concern and an instrument of personal ambition. Then he looked at the king and said simply, "I find no vulnerability here. Only a king who has remembered after 6 years how to let something matter." The council closed without formal action. Spring came to Veldrath the way it always did, gradually and then all at once, the frost retreating from the stones, the courtyard fountain releasing from its winter stillness, the birch trees along the eastern ridge shaking out their new green with something that looked almost like relief. Roman and I were married quietly, in the old chapel at the edge of the keep grounds, attended by Marta and Petra, and old Lord Foss, and a handful of household members who had become, without formal declaration, the people who mattered most. Lady Drusilla stood in the back and watched with the expression of a woman whose calculations had arrived at a conclusion she found, upon reflection, acceptable. Lord Cedric was not invited. He was, however, reassigned, by formal council vote, to the border garrison, where the winters were long, and the audience for his ambitions was considerably smaller. There was no grand ceremony, no row of Omega women in gray dresses waiting to be seen and sorted. There was only a stone chapel full of firelight, and the people who had chosen to stand in it, and a king who had spent 6 years learning the geography of his own grief, and had finally, carefully, found his way back to something worth protecting. I wore my gray cloak. Petra threatened to cry, and then did, considerably. Roman held my hand through all of it, the quiet vows, the short walk back through the courtyard, The simple feast in the war room library with good bread and warm mead, and Marta's expression of carefully managed contentment presiding over everything, like a benevolent weather pattern. When the others had gone, he stood at the window while I sat in my worn chair, my chair, which no one had moved in all these months, and the fire was low, and the room was warm, and the night outside was full of early spring stars. "Sing it," he said, without turning from the window. Not a command. The same way he had asked the seventh evening, an offering of space, waiting to see what I chose to do with it. I sang. The whole song this time. Every verse I had built over years in the dark. The small words about warm bread and lit hearths and rain against stone, and the particular grace of an hour when no one needs anything from you. The melody wound through the room and settled into the books and the maps, and the worn wood of the table and the stones of the walls, and I sang it fully and without apology, because I was no longer building beautiful things and hiding them where they could not be taken. Roman turned from the window when I finished. He crossed the room and sat in the other chair, his chair, and looked at me in the firelight with those winter-gray eyes that had followed a song through a dark corridor and changed both our lives, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The alcove in the eastern corridor sat empty now. I did not need it anymore. I had found something better. Not a hidden place to keep the things that mattered, but a life built wide enough to hold them openly, without apology, without fear. The fire burned low. The stars held their positions. And the war room library of Veldrath Keep, which had been for 6 years a room where a man came alone to think, became at last what it had always had the capacity to be, a room where 2 people came together to be known. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.